There's zero, not one scintilla of evidence of sepsis or any other infectious process in Cory's.
How do you find as to the charge of aggravated?
Guilty.
When 21-year-old Breanna Micciolo finally made the decision to seek child support for her 4-year-old son named Cory, she quickly found out the father to her child was a man in his mid-20s named Christopher Gregor. After filing for child support and going to court, it took about a year from the day he found out he was a father, but eventually Chris would start fighting for partial rights to his son, who he hadn't known up until this point. From the outside looking in, it looked like Chris was trying to do the right thing by his son. Turns out, Corey Micciolo's father coming into his life is the worst possible thing that could have happened to him, because after it happened, Brianna had to come forward and make over 100 separate reports about Cory. Throughout that time period of reports flowing in, nothing was done, and Cory in 2 years of meeting his father. Welcome back to the dark side of life. Brought into the world on May 1st, 2014, Corey Micciolo was born to his mother Brianna, who was just 17 years old at the time and still an 11th grader in high school. So Brianna was a child in her own right, who now had the responsibility of raising Corey alone, because his father wasn't in the picture to begin with. In fact, Corey wouldn't know who his father was for years to come. Brianna and Corey were residing in Englishtown, New Jersey, and being she hadn't even graduated high school yet, she was still living with her mother Rebecca and a few other family members. The young mother and son were as close as could be from the moment Corey was born, and Brianna loved him unconditionally. Corey was a bright soul who became incredibly creative very early on in his life, and he was also really intelligent. With Corey being raised solely by his mother for the first 5 years of his life, it's safe to say that Corey was a mama's boy, and they spent a great deal of time together.
What is the fifth planet from the sun? It is big, it is made of gas. It is Jupiter.
His loved ones would say that Corey was really interested in our solar system, space, and anything to do with our planets. He just wanted to learn more and more about them. He was also artistic for his young age and quickly learned how to draw different things, and art was the best way for Corey to utilize and express his creative mind. Life was good for Corey. His mother had her struggles, which we'll get into shortly, but other than that, Corey was happy, well taken care of, and destined to do great things.
So guys, this is my mommy, and your...
Around the time Corey was 4 years old, Brianna's mother Rebecca came up with the idea to seek child support from the father of her child. That way Brianna and Corey could get some monetary help from him, as well as potentially giving Corey the opportunity to get to know his father. When the conversation came up initially, Brianna didn't really want to go through with it, and she wanted to keep things the way they were. Although she was considering it, she didn't immediately jump on the idea. When little Corey was still 4 years old, Brianna was filling out an application for food stamps and health insurance for her and Corey, and that application required that she take a paternity test. So ultimately, after being prompted by this application process, Brianna would go get the paternity test done, revealing that the father to her child was 25-year-old Christopher Gregor, who at the time of Corey's conception was 21 years old. With Brianna being 16 at the time, he while she was, and no charges were ever brought against Gregor for this. Following this information coming to light when Corey was 4, Gregor would comply and he began paying Brianna child support for their son. Christopher Gregor, born in 1992, grew up in New Jersey and attended the Monroe Township High School where he graduated from, and he seemed to many people there like a promising young man. In high school, he was once recognized and selected to be part of the Heroes and Cool Kids program, this program being designed for the kids in middle school. The staff members would pick a few high school students who had awesome qualities like leadership, strength, and wisdom, and then they would mentor some of these younger kids because they were considered good role models by the staff and administration. After he graduated from there, he would attend college and ultimately received his Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from the University of Arizona, which is said to be an online school, as well as his Master's in Secondary Education and Teaching from Johns Hopkins University of Education. In the years after he graduated from college, according to his LinkedIn profile, he would find himself working in several different fields throughout New Jersey, Florida, and Maryland. Chris has been employed as a math teacher, a sales associate for a professional hockey team, a crisis hotline worker, and his most recent position being listed as a real estate agent for Red Door Real Estate there in New Jersey. Seemingly an accomplished young man who was just finding out which career path was the right one for him. Although, as I mentioned, once he learned that he had a 4-year-old son and they began seeking child support, he wouldn't enter Cory's life just yet. In the meantime, Brianna and Cory were just figuring out life together as a young mother and son. Brianna, at some point in her late teens, early 20s, began experimenting with, and before she knew it, she was using them more and more to cope with some of the trauma of her past. Things that she just didn't want to feel anymore, which eventually led to her becoming addicted to these substances, which is something she would openly admit to. She would later say that she went through a lot during her childhood, and she never really had any coping skills to deal with what she had been through, and eventually she found herself to get by. However, she swears she never when she had Cory or had them around him at any point. And by the looks of it, Cory is incredibly happy with his mother. Cory looks well-nourished, vibrant, and just full of life. It seems like there was nothing that could separate the two of them. That is until Cory was 5 years old and his father decided he wanted to be in his life. From that point forward, his life would become painful, unpredictable, and scary. According to the Jersey Shore Online, it was early in August of 2019 when Cory was just 5 years old, he began visiting his father and his side of the family. His father was living with his parents in a town called Monroe at the time the visit started. However, from the very moment Chris came into his life, there was signs that Cory was by Chris. On the very first visit, when Cory went over to his father's house to spend some time with them, he would return home with a busted lip. So when Brianna asked Cory, what happened to your lip, he wouldn't really give her an answer, and she took this incident and information to the police station because she was concerned he was already a young boy even though his visitation just began. The authorities would contact DCP&P, Department of Child Protection and Permanency, and they would allegedly investigate the information and incident that she reported. But when Chris told DCP&P that it was simply just an accident, he was trying to kick the soccer ball, but he missed and kicked Cory in the lip. After that, they would close the case. This was the beginning to what became a long list of injuries that Cory would return home from his father's with. To those who knew him, it was clear that Cory didn't really want to go spend time at his father's house, and according to his mother, he would become visibly upset on the days he had to go. Some days he would just start crying and trying to hide in closets or anywhere he could, kicking and screaming so that he wouldn't have to go to his dad's house. Although when Brianna would tell any DCP&P worker about this information, how distraught he was about having to go spend time at his father's house, they would just tell her he had to go. As time went on and Cory spent more and more time with his father, the evidence continued to pile up, while Brianna is still documenting and reporting these injuries to officials out of fear for her son. About a month after the visitation started, Brianna and Chris would end up going to court, and in October of that same year, 2019, joint custody was established for both the parents, meaning Cory was going to be living with his father part-time. The injury Cory was going through only worsened as his father got more and more time with him. Following one of his stays with Chris around Halloween of the same year, Cory returned home with what his mother said looked like rug burn, and it started on his face, it extended down his arms, and it also looked like his face had a slap mark on it. His mother once again would document these injuries and report them to the proper authorities in hopes that maybe somebody would investigate and figure out why her son keeps coming home with these injuries. During my research of this case and reading through the information, I stumbled across some of the pictures that she would take detailing Cory's injuries after a stay with his dad, and it made me sick to my stomach. Many of these pictures don't look like accidents, and it's just some of the most heartbreaking I've seen. After her son got home this time, Cory did admit to his mother that Chris told him he was too fat and made him run on the treadmill. She suspected those rug burn type injuries that he had were from Cory falling and landing against the rubber of the treadmill. Brianna said she reached out to DCP&P directly this time instead of going through the police. and DCP&P would go investigate and talk to the father about this report. Chris would admit that he did in fact put his son on the treadmill, at which point the DCP&P workers would tell him he was not to do that again, and it seems that was the end of it. Yet, as most of us know and have seen by the video that would later surface, he continued to use the treadmill as a son. Now, throughout this time period, Brianna had still been struggling with her, and I can only imagine it got worse when she didn't have Cory for X amount of days throughout the week, on top of him coming home with these injuries that she knew in her heart were caused by his father, intentionally. Eventually, in January of 2020, while Micciolo and Gregor are in this custody dispute, Brianna would end up losing her rights to her son altogether, meaning that Cory was now going to be living with Chris and his parents full-time. This was due to her substance abuse, and as soon as she lost Cory and he went to go live with his father, she immediately started taking the steps required to get her rights to her son back, which didn't happen fast, so Cory was now stuck living with his father for the following months. It ended up being from January until October of 2020 that Chris had full custody of Cory, and Brianna wasn't even allowed to see him during this time period. Although before she earned her rights back in October, 2 months prior in August, Chris and Cory moved out of his parents' house in Monroe and into an apartment in the Atlantic Heights apartment complex in Barnegat, which is approximately 50 miles away from where they were originally living in Monroe. It's impossible to say how difficult those 9 months were for Cory without his mother, but I can only imagine he was terrified and based on the injuries he would come home with, even during joint custody. Finally, after getting sober and hitting all the requirements necessary, Brianna was given her visitation rights back, so she was now able to spend some time with Cory again. Unfortunately though, Chris was still given residential custody, meaning that Cory was still going to be living with his father for the majority of the time. After the court ruling that took place on the 28th of October, there were many different rules and restrictions set by the judge regarding Micciolo's and Gregor's parenting situation. Brianna would be getting unsupervised visits with her son every other weekend and Wednesday afternoons. However, if she was to bring Cory back to her house, the judge ruled that no one was supposed to be in the house besides her and her mother Rebecca during her parenting time. But since she lived with several other family members, it made it extremely difficult for her to parent Cory at her house. Brianna and Chris were also to unblock each other on their cell phones and attend co-parenting classes together to work on their issues and skills. Furthermore, the duo was barred from making any disparaging remarks to Cory regarding the other parent, basically meaning they weren't allowed to say nasty things about one another moving forward. It's important to mention that these indications that Chris were always present, and it seems like it had to be almost constant. I say that because over an 18-month period, it's estimated that Brianna raised the alarm to police or DCP&P over 100 times. At some point after she gained her visitation rights to Cory back, she knew in her heart that Cory was father, so she convinced Chris to let her stay overnight at their apartment so she could just keep an eye on Cory. But then Gregor started demanding Brianna to even make that arrangement possible, despite the fact that she was just trying to keep their son safe. Eventually, she didn't want to deal with it anymore, and she stopped staying there and went back to her mother's house in Englishtown. It's also reported that a few months after she got her custody back, she would relapse once in December of 2020 and once in February of 2021, but would remain clean otherwise. An officer for the Barnegat Police Department named Angel Roman, who would later testify in court, spoke about a time he spotted Chris and his son playing in the high school football field in February of 2021. One day he noticed that Cory was in the end zone of the field while his father was throwing passes to him, and to him, it really looked like a normal father-son interaction. There was nothing unusual about the play. From the outside looking in, it may have seemed to many people that Christopher Gregor was trying to do the right thing by his son. Once he figured out he had a son, he went to court and got partial custody of him, and then he moved out of his parents' house so they could have their own apartment. He seemed well put together, he had a good job, yet no one would have known about these incidents if it wasn't for the documentation and dozens of reports made by Brianna. Because it's mentioned that Cory never really told anybody besides his mother and grandmother about what was truly going on at his father's house, and the truth about his father. On March 19th, 2021, Brianna had stayed over at Chris's house with Cory that night because she had a fun day planned for her and her son the following day. On top of that though, as I mentioned, it was incredibly difficult for her to take Cory back to her house, so instead she just stayed there so she and Cory could leave early the following morning. The next day, March 20th, was actually her father's birthday, and she knew that he would love spending it with his grandson. Although her father did live in Pennsylvania, which is approximately an hour and a half away from where they were in New Jersey. That mattered because between 2 and 3 p.m. p.m. that same day, she would have to be back at Chris's house to drop Cory off, because that was the time scheduled by the courts, which shouldn't be a problem considering they could leave early in the morning and make it back with enough time to drop him off. Chris was informed of these plans beforehand. He was aware they were going to Pennsylvania and he didn't mind it. So that's what they did. They started their day early and headed over to Brianna's father's house for an exciting day, which is exactly what it turned out to be. After successfully making it to Abington, Pennsylvania, they went out to eat, they got some ice cream, they played a little bit of mini golf, and really just enjoyed the time they were able to spend together. Now, Brianna admits that Cory was having such a good time and he was enjoying himself so much that it was hard for her to just rip him away from that and make him leave, even though she was fully aware she had to be back in Barnegat by 3 p.m. at the latest. So she took just a little bit extra time in Abington before ultimately telling Cory, like, look, we have to go now because I have to get you back to your dad's house. Cory and Brianna would hit the road and head back to Barnegat, New Jersey, which would normally take them about an hour and a half. However, they ran into some heavy traffic along the way. So Brianna did the responsible thing to do. She communicated to Gregor that she was running a little bit behind because she hit some traffic on the highway, but she's on her way and Cory will be there as soon as possible. At roughly 3:04 p.m., Gregor would text Brianna regarding her being late, saying, "When you get here, please just drop him off." When she got this message, she replied back with, "Okay." About an hour after this, Gregor would send another message to Brianna, who hadn't arrived yet, and it read, "You're almost 2 hours late. What?" The very next message read, "This Friday, however long late you are, is how long after 4:30 you can pick him up." Then another message comes through. "FYI, this is beyond pissing me off. Now my entire plans for the day are ruined." Brianna would then try to explain to him that she's trying to get Cory to him as fast as possible, replying to Gregor with, "I'm driving as fast as I can, I'm sorry." Then he says back to Brianna, "I don't care. Whenever you get here, we'll take the difference in time from 2 o'clock until then, and that is how long we will add on to 4:30 for when you come on Friday now." Following that up with a text that said, "I'm at the clubhouse gym, just drop him off here." And then Brianna would once again respond with, "Okay." Brianna and Cory arrived at the clubhouse gym to drop him off just before 4:15 p.m. Brianna parked her car near the entrance to the gym. Cory hops out and runs up to the door trying to get in, but the door was locked. So at 4:14 p.m., Brianna would text Chris saying he can't get in, at which point Chris would come open the door and let his son in. While Brianna sent one last message just apologizing for being so late. It read, "I apologize for being so late, and I mean it. I'm not saying this because I want you to change your mind about Friday. I will come at 6:45, no problem. It's understandable. But I did want to tell you there was no ill intentions there. I didn't mean to be so late." After dropping Cory off at approximately 4:15, Brianna left, but only once she knew Cory had made it inside and was now in his father's care. What followed has been what really seems like the focal point of this case, being the video that was captured on Saturday the 20th of March in 2020 in the athletic club of Chris's apartment complex. The security camera captured Chris, who was extremely upset about the fact Cory was late, deciding to take it out on the young boy by to run on the treadmill at high speeds. After Cory is seen sprinting on this treadmill for an extended period of time, he finally starts to fatigue. When Cory couldn't keep up with the pace of the treadmill anymore and he was finally shot off the back of it to the ground, his father would pick him up and place him back on the treadmill, trying to force him to start running again, and since he was struggling, he started top of his head incredibly hard until his son started running again. Then go turn up the speed of the treadmill while his son was already struggling. Even though Cory is giving it everything he has, it wasn't long before he was shot to the ground off the back of the treadmill once more. And every time after this, he would get up time and time again and try to jump onto the moving treadmill to start running again. But each time, he immediately and was shot to the ground. I mean, if you haven't seen it, Cory clearly had a lot of heart and he was running as fast as he possibly could. But his father is just heartless when struggle. The video is one of the most heartbreaking and infuriating things I've seen since I started doing this, and this dude makes me sick. Brianna wouldn't see Cory again for a couple days until her weekday visit Tuesday after school, and she would be visiting him around 4:30 p.m. at his father's house, and Chris was going to be home during this visit. Brianna ended up staying there with Cory until about 9:30 p.m. that night, and at some point, her and Cory decided they wanted to go on a walk throughout the neighborhood. On this walk, Brianna would notice several different Cory. There was one on his forehead and another one that looked like an odd-shaped imprint to her. These were incredibly concerning to Brianna, so she asked Cory once more, like, what happened? How did you get these? but she says he was just incredibly nervous and upset when she brought it up. It seems from her testimony that she didn't really get a straight answer from her son once again as to how he got the injuries he had, even though she knew in her heart where they came from. Within the following days, Brianna would make another referral to DCPMP regarding Cory's situation, this time telling them she is really concerned about his well-being because frequency only seemed to be worsening. It was the following Friday when Brianna decided she was going to make another call and another report concerning her son's safety. Yet it seems no matter how loud Brianna was about her concerns, they were never taken serious enough, and ultimately it would cost Cory his life within a week of this report. Furthermore, the following day, which would be Saturday, March 27th, Cory had some flag football tryouts that his father was taking him to. Brianna would drive herself there so she wouldn't miss her son's tryouts, and Cory did amazing. He was an athletic kid who shined throughout the process of trying out. Now, at some point while Cory was out on the field, Chris and Brianna would have a short conversation, and Chris would tell her she could actually just take Cory home for the night, which she happily did so she could spend some more time with her son, and of course Cory was ecstatic about it too. After they got home, Brianna would come to find several different located around Cory's body. There was a large one on his chest, then an even larger one on his hip, and a bunch of little ones on his arms and legs that looked like he had been grabbed really hard repeatedly or something. But the flag football was no contact, so they couldn't possibly have come from earlier when he was playing. At this point, Brianna knew she needed to do something, and fast, as she was genuinely starting to fear for her son's life. On March 30th, 2021, Brianna called a pediatrician place called Ivy Pediatrics and made an appointment to have Cory seen by a specialist there. She was following the suggestion of one of the DCPMP workers she had recently spoken to about his situation. The appointment was scheduled for the following day, April 1st. It was with a and she scheduled it for 5 p.m. because that's when her parenting time was. The day before the appointment, March 31st, Brianna would also file an emergency application for full custody of her son, and she did this through the family court. This was just another attempt at getting Cory out of the nightmare he was stuck in before it was too late. She felt in her heart that he was going to end up getting killed if they didn't do anything. When the time came, Cory was picked up by his mother and taken to this appointment at 5 p.m., where for the first time he revealed the treadmill incident that occurred over a week prior on the 20th. The pediatrician would listen to Brianna, Cory, and their concerns while examining Cory before eventually he referred them over to the Jersey Shore Medical Center for some tests. However, Brianna decided it would be quicker to go to the hospital that was closer to them to get the tests they needed to done because she was trying to hurry. She was already worried about dropping Cory off late again, and he was supposed to be home that night. Before long, they make it to the hospital where Cory is once more looked over. They run some tests on him, but overall, aside from some of his he was in good health. Unfortunately though, as hospitals aren't the quickest, it is now getting really late into the night, and Chris is livid with Brianna for being at the hospital with Cory and the fact that she's late again. I won't put you through each and every text of that night, but basically Brianna was supposed to drop Cory off that night, but she wasn't going to do so until Cory had been done being checked out, because that's what she was told to do by this worker. So they were getting blood tests, x-rays, and so on. At one point, Gregor had asked her, like, where are you at? And Brianna told him, look, I'm taking him to the hospital because that's what a DCPMP worker told me to do. A little while after she informs him that she and Cory are at the medical center, Chris would call her and tell her she needs to take Cory and leave the hospital against medical advice. When she doesn't oblige and says, I'm not leaving until Cory is done being seen, this enrages him further. Regardless, Brianna stayed at the hospital with Cory until they were properly discharged. Once it got late, around midnight, Chris had by then stopped responding and went to sleep. Brianna wanted to drop Cory off that night because that's what she was supposed to do. But since he went to sleep, her and Cory just went back to her mother's house in Englishtown after he was discharged, which wasn't until around 1 a.m. in the morning. They went to sleep at her mother's house in Englishtown, but she also knew she would have to get Cory to his father's house first thing in the morning. I'm going to court because you decided to go when you had 7 days last night, and by your text, you were still there at 12:50 at night. You would detriment to Cory's health, and I will be going to court today about it. By the way, school starts at 8:30, so have him back by 8:30. Brianna got Cory up and ready the following morning, which is now April 2nd of 2021, and they left heading to Barnegat to drop him off at his father's house so we could make it to school on time. Cory and Brianna would then pull up to Gregor's house, and Brianna would give Cory some of his medical reports, like an after-visit summary so that his father could see them. Cory would ask his mom, why do I have to take these papers to my dad? And she would tell him because he's your other parent and he has the right to look at them. After that, they said they loved each other and goodbye. Then Cory got out of the vehicle and headed into his father's apartment.
Did he ask me? Well, he's your other parent, so it's his right. He needs to see it because you went to the doctor, and I just want to make sure he sees that, okay? I'm not sure where he is. Yeah, he's inside. I don't know why the car's not here. That's strange.
Shortly after dropping Cory off at 8:37 a.m., her phone goes off again. I mean, considering you did son for an entire day and night, the minimum that is happening is an entire day and night will be removed from your next visit. Maximum, hopefully the courts will agree with my application this morning and you will lose all rights. Then Brianna and Gregor would go back and forth a little bit more that morning before ultimately they stopped talking. She didn't know it at the time, but when she dropped Cory off that morning, it would be the last time she spoke to her son alive. Brianna wouldn't hear from Gregor again until roughly 3:30 p.m. that same day, when Gregor called her out of the blue to tell her that Cory was incredibly lethargic, his legs hurt really bad, and he had been sleeping and vomiting all day long. But he called her because he needed Cory's insurance card, explaining to her that he's taking Cory to the hospital immediately, but he wouldn't specify exactly which one, so Brianna had no idea where her son was. Her immediate reaction was to start calling all of the nearby hospitals just to see if Cory was a patient there, but she had no luck. So she immediately just went to the police station to report her concerns that she can't find her son. Chris was seen carrying Cory into the hospital, and Cory looks exactly like he's been described. It's almost like he can barely even move because he is so weak and sick. It was just before 4 p.m. that afternoon when the duo showed up, and Cory's main nurse, Lindsay Carnival, described Chris as being emotionless as he brought his son in. According to the medical staff, Cory was in terrible shape. He had more bruises, he couldn't really speak, and they were trying to run as many tests as possible to figure out what was causing this condition. Then at some point, Cory was getting a CT scan, during which he had a severe seizure and needed to be rushed back to the room. I mean, the nurses said this was an all hands on deck type of situation. Shortly after having that seizure, his heart stopped beating, and the nurses immediately began life-saving measures on the boy, but he was still alive. During this time, his father is in and out of the room and eventually puts on a little show to seem as if he's overly distraught about Cory's condition, even though he's the one that caused it. Then at 4:52 p.m., he entered the room one last time, at which point Lindsay and some of the other techs are still providing life-saving care, trying to keep Cory with them. As soon as Gregor saw this was still going on, he turned around, left the hospital, and never came back again. Cory would pass away just 10 minutes later with not a single person he knew in the room with him. It was just him and the nurses who were trying to save his life. His father had basically already hit the highway. Mind you, Brianna has no idea which hospital her son was at or the fact that he just passed away. When medical staff asked Chris about Cory's mother and her whereabouts, Chris would just tell them she's and he didn't want her contacted, so the hospital wouldn't even call Brianna and inform her what's going on with her son. It was only after Cory had passed away at roughly 6 p.m. that night, the authorities would knock on the front door to her mother's house, and when Brianna answered it, they would inform her of her son's tragic passing. This left Brianna in pieces because when she dropped Cory off that same morning, he was just fine, and she knew it was Chris. Simultaneously, when Christopher Gregor heard the news that Cory did in fact die from his injuries, his immediate response was to leave the state, as if that doesn't scream I'm guilty. He ended up driving for days across several states until he made it to the border of Texas, seemingly knowing he was in some conducting searches along the way, such as can my car be tracked, or can my phone be tracked while it's in airplane mode? Regardless, he was still too paranoid and instead turned his phone off that same day, just a few hours after Cory died, and he wouldn't turn it on until late the next day. After he made it to the border of Texas, he allegedly had a conversation with his father, and it was after they talked, Chris would turn around and start heading back to New Jersey. On his way back home, 2 days after Cory's death as he is on the road, he ended up getting pulled over by an officer in Alcoa, Tennessee. These officers would spend some time talking to Chris, and he would just and explain to the officers how she's really the precursor to all this and just a bunch of other And after talking to the officers about what he was doing, he ended up leaving the scene and continuing his drive back home.
A lot of me thinks like, it's partially my fault in the sense that if they truly did something, it wouldn't, like, you had mother, but you'd still be alive if I never came back from Baltimore to fight for custody. And like, that's been going through my head this whole drive. And it's just got me fucked up. They played my people before and I got arrested for that in New Jersey. And I lost my teacher license. I don't. She's a special kind of dirtbag. You don't think they're being on there? No, 100% not. This is your car that you leased? Yes. From Maryland, you live in New Jersey? When I was in Maryland teaching, I got my master's degree from Johns Hopkins in special education and mathematics. I genuinely, my brother's in California, part of me wanted to go visit him. Bless you. I left at 5:30 Friday afternoon. I drove straight without any sleep. I couldn't sleep. I'm going to mention say you were in Texas. If you were in Texas, where in Texas do you think you were? Or Arkansas? I know, I definitely was in Arkansas. But that's way out of the way, right? I was driving on, what was that, 40 or something? But where does he go to Texas? I don't know, sir. I've just been driving. How are you going to serve you before you're in Texas? My initial Mexico? I'm trying to get the border solved crisis. No. I mean, if I was, I wouldn't be heading back to the direction of New Jersey.
Now, after returning home, Gregor would completely ignore Brianna and everything she had to say about and he continued living his life as if nothing ever happened. Christopher Gregor would remain a free man for the next year. For almost a year after young Cory's death, this man did not have to deal with the consequences. All the while, Brianna is making as much noise as possible to bring some awareness to Cory's case and get her son some justice. Even though she was advised against making any accusations, she knew she was not going to stop until the person responsible for Cory's death was in jail. Brianna would blast social media to make it known that her father after being ignored by DCPMP for over a year regarding his situation. She would also talk to several podcasts and channels on YouTube to share Cory's story. Chris Gregor did get arrested on July 7th, 2021, roughly 3 months after his son had passed. However, he was only charged with regarding the Treadmill incident. Because of that, he was released shortly after getting locked up due to New Jersey's bail reform. Other than that, he wouldn't be arrested and charged with Cory's murder until just shy of a year had passed in March of 2022. He was taken into custody and charged with first-degree murder, aggravated manslaughter, and endangering. There was a ton of testimony to go over in this trial, with several doctors weighing in on Cory's cause of death. One doctor was hard for me to even listen to, as he was adamant that Cory died from an infection and any injuries that he had to his chest area were from CPR being done for an extended period of time.
Now, do you have an opinion after you reviewed all the material in regard to Cory's cause of death?
I do.
Can you tell the jurors what that opinion is as to Cory's cause of death?
I think that Cory's cause of death has been confused because of extensive injuries caused by the CPR process. That I agree with a part of Dr. Ragasa's cause of death that indicates injuries to the heart and other organs, which I think is are typical vigorous CPR injuries. And I don't agree with that part, but I do agree with the inflammation and sepsis part of his diagnosis. The inflammation and sepsis part of Dr. Ragasa's diagnosis refers to inflammation in the lung and the finding on culture of bacteria in the lung that could cause pneumonia and sepsis. I think my cause of death is different than Dr. Regassa's in my opinion, that the injuries are all CPR injuries.
On the other hand, another doctor testified that there was 0% chance that Cory died from sepsis or any infection, and he was really killed by his chest and abdomen area. That was his real cause of death.
Cory died of injuries of the chest and abdomen, with laceration of the heart, left pulmonary contusion, and laceration and contusion of the liver.
As to the decedent's manner of death.
I did.
And can you tell the jurors what your opinion is?
Cory's manner of death is homicide. While there are many, many, many causes of death, typically in forensic pathology, there are only 5 manners of death.
When an autopsy was conducted, Cory was found to have an 1.5-inch laceration to his heart and lacerations and contusions to his liver, which one doctor said was from extended CPR and the other said was from... I'll let you decide which you believe. Gregor decided he wasn't going to testify during his trial and instead sat there looking angry throughout the most of it. He did break down a few times, but it was only momentarily. Brianna would give a long, powerful testimony detailing the events leading up to that fateful day, painting a clear picture on how evil and nasty Gregor is as a person and all the struggle she went through trying to save Cory's life. When the trial concluded, the jury deliberated for nearly 2 days before coming back with a verdict.
1. How do you find as to count 1 in
Guilty.
How do you find as to count 2 murder?
Not guilty.
How do you find as to the charge of
Guilty.
And you did not answer question 4?
No, sir.
At this time, thank you, Madam Foreperson, you can be seated. At this time, I'm going to poll the jury. Members of the jury, you've heard the verdict as read by your foreperson.
After getting convicted of endangerment of a child and aggravated, his sentencing date was set for August 2nd, 2024. He is currently being held in the Ocean County Jail while he awaits his sentencing.
Did you ever see Christopher hit Cory?
Never.
Have you watched the Treadmill video?
No,
Okay. Why not?
because I don't want to see.
So guys, this is my mommy and your...
With every second that passes by, Breanna Micciolo misses her son. She thinks about him all the time and will visit his gravesite at least 2 times a day. She also bought a plot of land right next to Cory's for when her time comes, so she can be buried right next to his final resting place, because she wants him to know that she is always right there with him. Brianna is still incredibly vocal about her and Cory's story, and she is out there making sure he is remembered as the amazing little boy he truly was, and not just the kid in the treadmill video. She is also suing DCPMP for the way they handled some of her concerns, and really for the way they handled Cory's case in its entirety. Brianna had her few relapses shortly before Cory passed away, but since then, she's been doing amazing and she stayed clean moving forward. On the morning of December 17th, 2022, Brianna would give birth to her daughter Elena Rose, who she knew she loved from the moment she was introduced to the world, saying that she knows she is an angel and she is so blessed to be her mother. Corey Micciolo is a kid that I will never forget. Such a sweet little guy who also wielded so much heart for a young 6-year-old boy. He was smart, loving, and just a playful kid who wanted to have fun and be loved. The thing he was probably the most passionate about was art. He was an incredible artist and he could express himself in many different ways. He loved to paint, draw, really anything related to art was something he was happy to partake in. It's just so heartbreaking the world lost Cory, who was destined to do great. He had interests and he wanted to learn things at his young age. As mentioned in the beginning, Cory was fascinated with our solar system, planets, and the universe. He just found it breathtaking. There's no doubt he was a special kid, and the world got darker the day he died. Cory, you hold a dear place in my heart, kid, and I know you're in a better place now. We won't let your memory go anywhere, and it will live with us forever. To the beautiful and strong Corey Micciolo, rest in peace, buddy. You're a soldier.
Would you wait for me?
Alright guys, that's gonna do it for today's video. If you made it to the end, go down to the comment section and comment give him the maximum so I know. If you want to, you can follow me on Instagram at Robert Clausen with 2 N's. If you have a story suggestion, DM me on there. I think that's all I have for you guys today. Again, I truly appreciate you. Thank you for your support and your patience. Also, a huge thank you to my Patreon members, and I'll see you guys again as soon as I possibly can. Peace.
Would you wait for me?